India-China rivalry and tensions, which acquired some seriousness in recent weeks and months, how that is proceeding, where is it going, what is the role of the US?
The U.S. Secretary for Commerce, Gina Raimondo, was invited by her Chinese counterpart to Beijing and Shanghai. And the idea is that the Chinese want to de-escalate. The Indians are trying to sort of focus on their economy, taking it well beyond where they have already reached as of last year, the fifth largest economy by GDP. They obviously do not want any trouble on any of their borders.
But let us not forget that India has a long way to go. I mean, in terms of either being a real competitor of China in pure economic terms.
I note that in one of my recent pieces, that there is no way that India is going to become the next China anytime soon.
So, where do you see Pakistan fitting into this uneasy, somewhat tense peace between India and China?
Pakistan's problems have reached a level where I don't think that Islamabad can afford to, have an acrimonious relationship with New Delhi, especially with its close relationship with Beijing, cannot afford to get into this mess.
Yes.
And its interest is to stay out of it.
Hello and welcome to New Wave Global, and I'm joined by Kamran Bukhari from the Newsline Institute in Washington, D.C. And today we are going to discuss, the India-China rivalry and tensions, which acquired some seriousness in recent weeks and months, and how that is proceeding, where is it going, what is the role of the US, and are India and China seriously on the path of further confrontation, or are they going to stop and take a step back? So, welcome, Kamran, once again. Thanks for your time, and let's begin. You've just written two very interesting articles that I was reading earlier this evening, and basically in which you elaborated the sort of incentives for both the parties to, posture a line of confrontation, but also to withdraw and contain the level of confrontation. So, can you elaborate a bit what has been happening in recent months? I mean, this whole in the Indian media, there's a lot of talk about this Chinese hostility, and I'm sure in the Chinese media as well, there must be talk of fixing India or whatever, teaching India a lesson.
Well, thank you, Raza. Let's start from the strategic level. So let's bring the United States in, and let's look at both countries with respect to the United States. There is an intensifying U.S.-China, if you will, rivalry or competition. Although, with the Chinese economy really taking a plunge, I think that some of the steam of that rivalry is dissipating. And probably the biggest evidence is that the U.S. Secretary for Commerce, Gina Raimondo, was invited by her Chinese counterpart to Beijing and Shanghai. And she was there for almost a working week. And the idea is that the Chinese want to de-escalate, both on the more importantly on the trade front. Obviously, the military is neither here nor there. There wasn't a military front, so that's one part of the equation. Second part of the equation is U.S.-Indian relations are increasing. U.S.-Indian alignment is increasing. We saw that with the visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Washington, the red carpet that was rolled out by the Biden administration. We just had India successfully land on the moon and on the South Pole, which no other country has achieved. So that's a boost to India's position. And then President Biden will be in New Delhi for the G20 summit in a few days, next week. And so Clearly, where U.S.-China relationship is bad, the U.S.-Indian relationship is going from good to to greater heights, if you will. So, uh, if you then within that framework, you have to look at what India and China are doing with each other. The Indians are trying to sort of focus on their economy, taking it well beyond where they have already reached as of last year, the fifth largest economy by GDP. They obviously do not want any trouble on any of their borders, particularly with China, because China is one of those powers that if there was a serious conflict between India and China, that would be damaging for India and, of course, for China as well. But India is concerned about that. Uh, so India is trying to sort of say, look, we don't want any trouble. But we've seen some very odd behavior going all the way back to almost a decade. But in recent years, since 2020, there's been an uptick in tensions, especially with the Galwan Valley incident. And then we had an incident in the Tawang sector in Arunachal Pradesh back in December of last year. So we see China strategically poking India. And the purpose of that is to, obviously prevent India from concentrating A, on its economic development, and B, of course, the maritime capabilities that the US and India are jointly trying to develop for New Delhi. So this is where we are right now, and this is sort of, if you will, the current situation. Obviously, there are constraints in terms of on the Chinese in terms of how far they can go, but that's where we are right now.
Yes, thank you, Kamran. I just want to quickly add here that, yes, it's true that India is now world's fifth largest economy, and its growth trajectory has been impressive. It has outpaced China in the past 2 years. But let us not forget the bigger picture. The Chinese economy is 5 times, if not more, larger than Indian economy. The Chinese overall GDP earlier this year, I remember the figures were that, it was somewhere between 17 and 18 trillion dollars versus India's GDP of 3.2 trillion. So the difference, even now, even though they are big countries, world's most populous countries, and of course for the US, India is rather important. But let us not forget that India has a long way to go. I mean, in terms of either being a real competitor of China in pure economic terms. Even Chinese slowdown is somewhere between 4 to 5% GDP. So, in that sense, do you think that this view of comparing the two, or creating this kind of a parity between the two countries from a regional power perspective or a global power perspective, do you think it's fair? Or
No, and I note that in one of my recent pieces, that there is no way that India is going to become the next China anytime soon.
Hmm.
And sort of, that's kind of the straw man argument that's out there, that's being sort of posited and then shot down. I think that's a bit shallow analysis. The real analysis is, to what extent can India replace China as an industrial hub of the world? That's the big
Right.
question. And the answer to that is unclear. The United States obviously wants to work with India, and it's very obvious in the maritime space, to provide a military counter to China. But far more importantly, and which is less talked about in the open sources, is that Washington is interested in reducing the world's dependency on manufactured Chinese products. So the way to do that is to find an alternative. India is a logical contender for that, but it requires massive amounts of investments. It requires time, and even then, the gap that you noted is not going to be, basically reduced. It's not going to be significantly reduced. Best case scenario, in my opinion, in the foreseeable future, is that there are, if we, the West can put in investments led by the United States, provided that the Indian regulatory environment, the Indian investment climate, the Indian political economic stability is as such that private sector companies from the West, from the United States, go into India in droves. That's sort of the assumption here. So let's say that the Indians provide for a decent investment climate.
It
Even
does.
then,
Yes. Yeah.
even then, India at best can take out some of, if you will, the monopoly that China has as the world's factory. But it's not going to replace. It's hardly going to even come close to that. But I think that that's what the United States wants to do, is to reduce the dependency that the world has on China.
Yes, of course. From a strategic and an economic perspective, I totally get that, and I agree with you. In one of your articles, you also noted how some of you listed the red flags about the you mentioned political stability. I mean, and you mentioned that the kind of violent acts against India's minorities, or the tensions in Manipur, northeast of India, which were recent witness and also reported globally. And you mentioned them as the potential impediments for this foreign investment to flow towards India. How serious do you think that is? Do companies really care about this?
They do care. They
Okay.
do care because I know I'm constantly being asked by different companies, "Hey, what do you think about serious investment into India?" I
Hmm.
mean, we're probing, we're interested, would love to get your take on it. And my view is, look, it's promising, but at the same time, you have all these problems, and it's not like I'm telling them that there are these problems. They're already aware of those problems. It's not lost on the Western investor or Western companies that there is communal problems in India, and this is separate from sort of the bureaucratic red tape hurdles that exist in India, even if they didn't have the communal problems. So between the two, that makes for not a very favorable environment for companies to go in and invest. So there's a lot of work that the Indian government has to do. As I note in my paper, this is also a strategic challenge for the United States. Look, I mean, in China, you have an authoritarian regime, and that can sort of mobilize resources and basically flip the switch and get things done because of the nature of the regime, and make it conducive for growth or for opportunities. We saw that in the past, in the 80s and the 90s. We saw Western investment going into China because of that. The problem with India is that India is, a democracy, and a very complicated democracy. Its federalism means that the central government has limited authority, and and there's a lot of authority vested in the states, in the regional governments. There's also the issue of political stability, because on one hand, uh, there is stability because you have the BJP having an overwhelming majority in parliament. So you don't have like a weak government. You have a government that's very strong, but at the same time, the cost of that strength is fueled by a right-wing nationalism that that sort of is sort of undercutting that entire incentive for companies to go in. So on one hand you have stability, but then you have the threat of instability, because yes, the Modi administration, the BJP government, wants to achieve India's geoeconomic ambitions and imperatives, but their entire political business model is heavily dependent on a an electoral base that for whom Hindutva it resonates very well. It's the secret to their success, if you will. So how do they balance between the two? How do they make sure that they remain ideologically committed so they can get the votes, maintain the majority in parliament, but at the same time not allow that right wing nationalism to destabilize India at the communal level.
Yeah, that's a well, I mean, that's a tricky situation because, as you know, Kamran, rather well, how such things can are inherently destabilizing. But anyway, that is for the Indian government and Indian leaders to think about if they really want this trajectory. And I think I would add that seeking regional peace, both with Pakistan, Iran, are also key to to India's ambitions of attaining regional and global, power. And I think for Pakistan as well. I mean, I want to bring Pakistan in because how can we not when we're talking about India and the neighborhood? So where do you see Pakistan fitting into this uneasy, somewhat tense peace between India and China?
I think that so there are two ways to look at this. So on one hand, Pakistan's problems have reached a level where I don't think that Islamabad can afford to, have an acrimonious relationship with New Delhi.
Yeah.
And Pakistan cannot afford, especially with its close relationship with Beijing, cannot afford to get into this mess. And
Yes.
its interest is to stay out of it. Certainly, the United States would like to not want Pakistan to get involved with this. And there's always the question in Washington, as you are well aware, that in our efforts to contain China, in our efforts to work with India, where is Pakistan? What can we expect from Pakistan? On one hand, there are those who say, look, Pakistan is so weak and dependent on the United States and its allies for its own well being that it's unlikely for Pakistan to take any misadventure or miscalculate and do something that would be detrimental to U.S. interests for the region and for globally speaking. But on the other hand, a weak country like Pakistan, becomes more and more susceptible and vulnerable to influence and pressure from countries like Beijing and China, and even the Gulf countries. But obviously the Gulf countries are allies of the United States. But then the big question is, to what extent can China arm twist Pakistan and leverage that relationship in its efforts to pressure India? And so, it's at the end of the day, if you look at it rationally, one would think that Pakistan would like to steer clear of this mess. But on the other hand, if you are, susceptible to influence and undue pressure, then it's hard to tell.
It's hard to tell. Yes, yes, I totally agree with you. And Kamran, on the final thought, so don't you really think that there's a school of thought? I mean, in a reasonably growing circle in the United States. Of course, not the mainstream and not allied or affiliated with the power circles, but where they say that American empire is an empire in decline, and it either needs to confront that reality, do something about it, accept it, or reinvent its future, its ambition, rescale it, or it could continue to be sort of unfazed by the fact that Asian powers like China are now globally, are global players. And with the rise of BRICS, for example, and other developments, it is certainly not no longer the unipolar world that perhaps the US had enjoyed for a few decades. What do you say to that?
I would argue that the decline of the United States is quite hyped, and it's been hyped for as long as I can remember. We in people who are from South Asia, we've been hearing this since we were kids,
Yeah.
and sort of there's some fantasization of this sort of idea. But the reality, if you look at the reality, the Chinese economy is, in a serious downturn. The China, even before it could sort of translate its economic power into military power, is now experiencing this economic downturn. So, and China has not, and multiple crises going on. There's a political crisis, even within the economic realm. You have the debt crisis, you have the housing crisis, you have non-performing loans, and the economy is in bad shape. So I don't think that China is in a position to challenge the fact that the Minister of Commerce of China actually asked the U.S. Commerce Secretary to come over and discuss and ways in which we can reduce these tensions, shows that where China stands right now. Russia's position is very clear. Its status is very clear in the wake of the Ukraine war, its dismal performance, the sanctions on it, and the infighting happening within the Kremlin. So if these are the two powers behind BRICS, and India is a third power in BRICS, and India is aligning with the United States, so then you ask yourself this question, and not that BRICS was anything serious to begin with, then what is the future of BRICS? You can add Iran into the mix, you can have other countries join in, but what is it really? Is it a military alliance? Is it a political alliance? Is it an economic alliance? Or is it just one of those anti-Western clubs that take place and they gather with each other? There's a lot of media coverage, but at the end of the day, in pure geopolitical terms, nothing really comes out of it. So I would say, look, not that the United States doesn't have its problems. There are a lot of them. But the United States is still the world's superpower. The United States is still guaranteeing security for multiple regions in the world. Still the largest economy, and I doubt it's still the center of gravity of the international system. I doubt that will change anytime soon, especially given, and even if the United States were to experience a serious economic downturn, the other players, the nature abhors vacuum, and in this case, the nature of the international system, there isn't going to be a vacuum. So the United States is going to be there, even if it's weakened. There's nobody else to take its place, and so I don't think that the United States is in serious decline, but I do think that every other player that is trying to challenge the United States is in serious decline.
That is a very interesting answer, and I wish that we had more time because I would have unpacked your statement. And but I think let's leave it for our next episode of this discussion, and we'll certainly explore this both in terms of what you just said, but also in terms of the problems that internationally or globally US has to contend with. But that's for a later date. Thank you so much, Kamran, and let's hope to have you back sooner than later. And thank you, viewers. If you like this video, please share it and also give us feedback, your comments. If you have questions for Kamran, feel free to write them. And for our Indian friends, don't get too upset at what we say. We're just doing our job. Thank you.